Welcome everyone to the webinar, Labor Migration Governance in West Africa in the Wake of the Pandemic. My name is Camila Coase, and I am a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. And I'd like to start with a housekeeping note. If you have any technical problem, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. We will have a Q&A at the end of the call after our discussion with the panelists. There will not be a voice Q&A, so please type any question you have in the Q&A chat box or email them at events@migrationpolicy.org. Related to this webinar and as part of a recent project with the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ and GIZ, Kate Hooper and myself recently released a policy brief precisely on the topic of today's discussion, deepening labor migration governance at a time of immobility, lesson from Ghana and Senegal. And so I'd like to start today with a few rapid introductory remarks before delving into the discussion with our panelists. And we've had three starting points for this conversation today. The first one is the effects of COVID-19 on regional mobility. We know the pandemic has had far-reaching economic consequences on economies in West Africa. And one main issue has been the ongoing border closure, travel restrictions, as well as changing public health measures at the border. All of this have curtailed labor migration in West Africa, and they've added a layer of complexity to migration management in the region. The second aspect that we'd like to delve into is how countries like Ghana and Senegal that have tried in the past year to develop or update their migration policy, but also set up adequate governance structure to implement them, with many questions on how to maximize the benefits of migration for development, how to push toward free movement within the ECOWAS region, while continuing to protect local workers and business. And finally, how migrants can contribute to the recovery efforts after the pandemic. And then our third main question for today is, what is the role of development cooperation in all this? European and bilateral development agencies have been active in the past years on migration programs in West Africa, providing technical assistance, funding. And in the past month, there have been various efforts to think about what migration programming will look like under the new EU budget. And so in this context, we're going to ask ourselves how development agencies can best support African countries in resuming mobility and enhancing the development benefits of labor migration. To discuss all of this issue, we have today four panelists: my colleague Kate Hooper, who is a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute; Leander Kandilije, who is a senior lecturer of migration studies at the Center for Migration Study at the University of Ghana; Lamfia Diane, who is advisor and economist at the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Cooperation in Senegal; and Dennis Rotgen, who is senior policy officer at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation Development in Germany. And maybe I'll start with Kate, my colleague, to ask a few questions on the situation in West Africa. And Kate, I was wondering whether you could maybe preview some of the findings from the paper you author on how the pandemic has disrupted labor migration in West Africa and the implication for labor migration governance.
Thanks, Camille. So I will first start by providing a little bit of context on labor migration in the region. As you alluded to, there's significant cross-border movement in the region, both for work and for other reasons. In 2019, before the pandemic hit, there were an estimated 10.1 million West African migrants living in other countries, about 2/3 in other countries in West Africa, and then about 1/3 living outside of the region. So for example, Europe, the Gulf countries, and North America. But this is likely to be quite a significant underestimate, especially for West Africa, given that there are quite porous borders in the region. So safe to say that labor migration is an important dynamic within the region. And the ECOWAS free movement area helps facilitate this cross-border trade and mobility as well. There are a series of protocols that allow for visa-free travel, and there's also the right to reside and work in another member state. So that's the legal context that a lot of this labour migration happens under. But like in other regions, we've really seen the pandemic disrupt these movements significantly. Countries moved quickly to close their borders to try and slow the spread of COVID-19 in spring of 2020, even within the free movement areas. So in an area where there weren't border controls in the same way, suddenly citizens found themselves unable to move or return to another country within the region. And of course, one result is that we saw significant populations stranded right on either side of the border and needing assistance to return home. So that's one sort of obvious effect of the pandemic for these populations. And it's also impeded cross-border trade, and that's had knock-on effects for border communities in particular as well. It's not possible to fully seal any border, particularly in the region, but that's generally true anywhere. But it's safe to say that there has been a significant disruption to mobility. And 18 months on, things still aren't back to normal. We've seen air travel resume with new public health measures in place, so things like testing before departure or post-arrival, and quarantine measures for people who say test positive for COVID-19. But a number of land borders still remain closed 18 months on, so the effects of the pandemic are still being felt. So just to talk briefly about what this means for labour migration governance going forward before we hear from the other panelists. Improving the governance of labour migration has been a priority for years, and we'll hear a little bit more specifically about Ghana and Senegal and their efforts in this area in a moment. But the focus has been perhaps more on managing emigration processes, so ensuring fair and ethical recruitment of nationals, engaging the diaspora, and there's also been some efforts to improve the management of immigration into national territories as well. But that's perhaps been a little bit less of a focus. And one of the sort of areas that we've seen a lot of work in this field has been sort of implementing the protocols under ECOWAS as well. But the pandemic has really sort of, again, disrupted these efforts, right, and sort of switched up the priorities. We've seen that diaspora engagement is a really important priority now. But we've also, seen that it's perhaps a little bit more politically sensitive. So if you're talking, for example, about facilitating free movement and ensuring full access to local labour markets, the economic downturn can make that a bit more complicated. There's a lot of sensitivity around protecting livelihoods of locals. So that's one area where the pandemic perhaps, changes the political context a little bit when talking about labour migration governance. But I think that the last 18 months has also really made the case for why effective governance is so important, and also why cooperation is key as well. COVID-19 has made many labour migrants more vulnerable, whether they can't access healthcare, whether they're having to work or live in unsafe conditions, or whether they end up losing their job and being stranded in place. So this is where having effective frameworks that really set out and enforce the rights of labour migrants is really important. And I think that really illustrates the importance of cooperation in this area as well. Cooperation regionally as well can be a key for restarting mobility safely. I think that, like in other regions of the world, countries moved quickly and acted unilaterally to try and sort of slow the spread of COVID-19, but that had a lot of knock-on effects and illustrated the perils of not coordinating these actions with your neighbours. If one country closes a border, there's knock-on effects for their neighbours. Travel restrictions, if not, rolled out with the awareness of the other country that it's affecting, can leave people stranded, that sort of thing. So I think that there's a clear case there for improving coordination between neighbouring countries in particular, and also when now thinking about rolling out new public health measures and trying to restart mobility safely as well. We've seen some steps being taken in this direction by ECOWAS, for example, setting a sort of common fee for COVID tests for its citizens. But I think there's more that could be done in this area to really try and coordinate on efforts to restart mobility and rolling out these measures as well. And I think that developing a regional response also helps potentially speed up efforts to restart inter-regional mobility. So that is from West Africa to other regions of the world as well. we're seeing a situation where countries are reopening selectively based on different public health criteria, and they're relying on digital credentials to do so in some cases. And I think that's where this complex map of efforts, it's a bit easier to sort of navigate if you're working together with your neighbors and using a sort of regional approach to then go and negotiate rather than having each country try and do that on their own. So I think that's another area where better governance and more cooperation is potentially very useful as well. And then final point is, again, this point around diaspora engagement. I think that the pandemic really illustrated the importance of consular services to support overseas nationals, and also the importance of remittances as well. So I think that's one area where, again, there's a clear case for governance going forward, and that's perhaps one of the sort of priorities we might see emerge in the next few months.
Thanks, Kate, for this overview. And I'd now like to turn to Lander from the University of Ghana to zoom on the situation there. So Lander, you've closely followed the development of Ghana migration policies. Can you tell us first why labor migration policy has been high on the agenda of the government, and maybe what has driven the decision to adopt a dedicated labor migration policy in 2020?
Right, thank you very much, Camille. Ghana developed a national migration policy in 2016, exactly for the purposes that have been outlined by Kate, to harness the developmental impacts of migration towards socioeconomic development, but also to minimize the negatives that are associated with migration. Then from that overarching national policy, there was a need for sectoral policies to be developed. And the national labor migration policy is one of two policies. The second one is the diaspora engagement policy. So the main rationale for the labor migration policy specifically was aimed at four key objectives or key targets that the government set for itself. First of all, to be able to govern labor migration properly, to allow us to extract these benefits that are associated with labor migration. But secondly, to also extend rights to labor migrants and members of their households. And thirdly, to target the developmental implications that are embedded in labor migration broadly. And finally, to look at the issues of data, so migration data, and then issues of migration information systems. So for the labor migration policy, it came into effect in 2020. And since then, since it was launched, we've adopted a multi-sectoral approach with the establishment of a technical working group, which comprises of all the key government ministries, departments, and then agencies, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations, and the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection, and other ministries, with the support of development partners like GIZ on behalf of the German government, and then IOM. They've been instrumental in adapting this multi-sectoral approach. And a step that is supposed to help the process is the fact that we have come out with national work plans for each of the ministries, specifically in the area of labor migration. And each ministry is supposed to report on a quarterly basis the progress they have made, the targets they set for themselves, and key performance indicators have been set by the coordinating ministry, which is the Ministry of Employment and Labor Relations. And a lot is going on within that type of framework. One of the members, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, on its own has also collaborated with the Diaspora Office of the President to champion the drafting of a diaspora engagement policy. And a lot of the aspects of this policy also touch on issues of labor migration, the rights of migrants, and also what to expect from the migrant community abroad. So if I just spend a couple of seconds talking about the diaspora engagement policy, which is related to the labor migration policy, we adopted a conceptual framework, which is supposed to be structured in three forms. First of all, we realized that it was important for us to build the capacity of diaspora institutions abroad and also collaborating institutions nationally or locally. But secondly, to extend rights to migrants before the third strand of attempting to extract benefits from labor migrants, because the tendency is for governments to think solely on the issue of remittances and what they can get from the diaspora without, first of all, looking at or reflecting on the rights that need to be extended to members of the migrant community. So labor migration, when well managed within the context of Ghana, is intended to help us leverage on the benefits that we are aware of beyond just remittances, skills transfers, and so on and so forth, towards our targeted national development exercise. The Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection on its own is also tackling another dimension of labor migration from this perspective of human trafficking, human smuggling, and also irregular migration. So we are tackling labor migration from different angles. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs looking at diaspora aspects, the Ministry of Gender looking at issues of trafficking, and then the Labor Ministry focusing solely its attention on issues of labor migrants in the country and also Ghanaian labor migrants abroad. And this is heavily supported by the GIZ. They have the Ghanaian German Center for Jobs, Migration, and Reintegration, which is playing a critical role. Under that setup, they've recruited the services of some key consultancy firms like GFA. We also have the Collective Leadership Institute, and all these are building the capacity of the different players in the area of the management or the governance of labor migration in the country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lander. I think very interesting what you mentioned about the overall architecture, to start with this overall migration policy and then go into this thematic aspect, and also the governance of this policy. All this ministry being involved, but the steering being done by one ministry, and the development of all these different work plan with key performance indicators. That all sound very promising, and I just wanted to ask, from your perspective, what have been the main obstacles to rolling out this policy since last year? And maybe specifically in the context of the pandemic, has added to the difficulties to implement it?
Yes. So one key strand in the national migration policy, and then for that matter, the national labor migration policy, is the establishment of the Ghana National Commission on Migration. This is supposed to be an entity or a vehicle which will coordinate all issues migration in the country. And unfortunately, since 2016, when the national migration policy was launched, to date, the Ghana National Commission on Migration is yet to be set up. The good news, though, is that with the support of IOM and the GIZ, we are in the process of establishing this commission, and we are hoping that this coordinating vehicle will allow us to govern labor migration in a coherent manner. We have several policies around labor migration, but there is policy incoherence in the country. And we need to bring all the critical players together so that there's that seamless approach to the governance of labor migration in the country. The issue of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, it has actually taken a toll on the efforts that were initiated before the onset of the pandemic. So for instance, in the area of capacity building, there have been several attempts by development partners to try and then build the capacity of ministries, departments, and then agencies. However, because of the pandemic, we haven't had the opportunity to have physical meetings for an extended period of time, at least 18 months. Now, a way out that has been identified by GIZ mainly is to adopt hybrid approaches. So you have a few people around the table and then the rest join virtually. And this is proven to be an effective way around the setbacks that are associated with the pandemic. Then you can also look at the issue of the location of some key institutions that are targeted at managing migration-related issues. So we have the Diaspora Affairs office of the president, for instance, is inaccessible to the ordinary labor migrant who returns to the country. It used to be located at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, but with the change of government, that has been relocated. And some people are of the view that key institutions that are supposed to champion the affairs or the interests of migrants should be in ministries that are easily accessible. Because of security screening processes, an institution that is located at the presidency is not one that can be easily accessed by labor migrants. So this is another setback, even beyond the issue of the pandemic. Then the issue of funding is a critical one. I know it's a common challenge with all initiatives, but funding has been a big problem that has faced the different ministries that have attempted or have been championed or designated or mandated to lead the effort in managing or governing labor migration. Fortunately, some funding is coming through from the development partners, and the issue now is to make sure that we have the coherence and then utilize the funds in a way that will maximize the potential benefits of coordinating migration to be able to enlist the potential benefits that are associated with labor migration. So these are some challenges that capacity building, funding, issues of the pandemic, the location of institutions in the wrong ministries or government setups. These are some of the issues that come to mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leander. And I think we'll go back to this question of development cooperation in a minute, but I'll now turn to Lamphia, who's from the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Cooperation in Senegal, for an overview of the situation there in the country. So maybe, Lamphia, if you can tell us a bit about how many people are still moving to work or for other reason, despite the current border closure in Senegal. Maybe we'll start there with a bit of context.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Camille, and thanks to all the panelists and participants for your presence. Frankly, for the question, we don't know presently how many people are still moving for work or other reason in our country. The deficit of migration statistic is a crucial problem in our country. And I think it is the same case for all developing countries nowadays, notably in the context of pandemic COVID-19. Any census or survey allow us to estimate relevantly the flow or the stock of Senegalese migrants in general, and Senegalese labor migrants in particular. We have real problems with migrant statistics. For example, in 2006, the Senegalese sectoral policy letter of Senegalese abroad estimated between 2.5 million to 3 million the number of Senegalese abroad. Well, 7 years later, exactly in 2013, the United Nations Population Division estimated to only 533,000 the number of Senegalese abroad. And this number is largely less than the first number which is given by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 7 years ago. The gap between the two numbers is very high. So we have a real problem with migrant statistics. In other side, there is not enough internal budgetary resource allocated to produce regularly migration statistics in our country. Our national statistic system is weakly operational, and our national development strategy, which is in its third edition, is also weakly implemented. Therefore, the problem of statistic deficit is real in our country, notably the deficit of migration statistics. And that's why presently we don't know exactly the number of people we are still moving for work or other reasons. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's thank you. That's a good point, and for pointing out like the gap in the statistic you can work with now, also to plan for the response. And I wanted to follow up on this, on the national migration strategy in Senegal. We know Senegal is in the process of reviewing it. Could you tell us a bit about how much of a priority is labor migration for the Senegalese government, and why that is?
No. Our national migration policy is not under review, but it's awaiting the government validation. The technical validation by the National Steering Committee is already done. So we are waiting the official seal or stamp of the government. Nevertheless, there are few initiatives in perspective to make sectoral migration strategy for managing irregular migration and labor migration. But don't worry, all the sectoral migration strategy will be based on the national migration policy, vision, and strategic orientations. Presently, we need the government validation of our national migration policy for erecting migration national issues on the level of national development priorities, and give to our country a consensual vision and strategic orientation in the field of migration. And in other side, the implementation of this national migration policy action plan will support our country to ensure a global coherence between different migratory projects and activities implemented in Senegal. Moreover, in other respect, the Senegalese diaspora contribution to the household living condition improvement by the level of remittances can be followed by the implementation of our policy, our national migration policy. And the migrant financial transfer, very important. The implementation of this policy can help our country to enhance the national, local, private sectors by the migrant investments. It can help us to reinforce the national human capital by organizing the transfer of knowledge and know-how of skilled Senegalese migrants. And it can help us to promote legal or regular migration and fight against irregular migration. And it can help us to promote the respect of Senegalese migrant human rights and the human rights of immigrants in Senegal, and also to address the gender issues of the migration topic. And it can help us to address also the environment issues, notably the climate change issues and health issues in link with migration. And the implementation of this national policy, migration policy action plan, can allow our country to set up a highly efficient system of migration statistic production. So we highly need a national migration policy for a better governance and management of migration issues and problems in Senegal. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamia, for this overview and stressing out the importance of coherence at the policy level, which should also help with coordinating on programmatic efforts at field level, but also pointing out this issue of climate change and how at policy level you can try to address climate and migration, which I think has been an ongoing discussion in a number of capitals. So I'd now like to turn to our final speaker, Denise from BMZ. because Germany has been a partner of West African countries to strengthen their labor migration policy framework, and Leander talked about that. But you've also been active at continental level. So maybe if you can tell us about how, as a development agency, you've supported the African Union in improving labor migration governance at continental level. And second, what are the main challenges that remain to achieve the African Union objectives?
Yeah, many thanks. It's a pleasure for me to speak here, and hello to everyone. Let me start by saying that German development cooperation pursues a comprehensive and gender responsive approach with regard to migration and development. This comprises migration policy advice, diaspora cooperation, voluntary return and sustainable reintegration, and legal migration. We support African partner countries, regional cooperation, as well as the African Union in managing and designing migration in a way that it benefits countries of origin, of destination, as well as migrants. And indeed, we support a number of partner countries in West Africa, including Ghana and Senegal. For example, by funding advice centers for jobs, migration, and reintegration in our program, Returning to New Opportunities, in cooperation with national authorities to provide individual counseling to interested persons on regular migration, including travel restrictions due to COVID-19, risks of irregular migration, employment opportunities, and the centers also help returnees to reintegrate socially and economically in their respective countries. We also support the diaspora in Germany in their engagement in African countries of origin, for example, through projects, short-term assignments of experts, and also entrepreneurship. As was already mentioned by Leander, in Ghana, we also support the government in the revision and implementation of the national diaspora engagement policy, and also support the implementation of the national labor migration strategy. Also briefly on the regional level, BMZ supports the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and its member states in implementing regional migration policies and better migration management with several projects. But also in West Africa, we have financed a project that, among other aspects, aims to facilitate and promote exchange of experience and transfer of migration practices among stakeholders in Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Senegal, based on memoranda of understanding that Morocco signed with the 3 other countries in order to step up cooperation on migration issues. But today I will focus on our engagement on labor migration governance at the continental level, namely our support to the African Union, since labor migration in Africa is increasing and largely intra-regional, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. This is an important area of cooperation. So German development cooperation thus supports the implementation of the joint program on labor migration governance of the African Union, which is a key pillar of the EU's overarching migration policy framework for Africa. This support, now it gets a bit technical, has included the development of a training and capacity building strategy for the program. And within the strategy, a training module for labor migration administrators and attachés on labor migration was developed and implemented. The JLMP program also recognizes that free movement of workers is crucial to advance regional integration and development in Africa. Therefore, German development cooperation has supported the development of free movement guidelines on the labor migration related provision in the EU Free Movement Protocol. These are used, for example, in developing regional free movement schemes and regional and national labor migration policies. Moreover, we supported the African Union Commission in the implementation of the Migration Policy Framework for Africa, the MPFA, by providing institutional capacity development and technical support, for example, on a sensitization campaign of the EU Commission on the MPFA. And in the next phase of our cooperation with the EU, we plan to focus more on the support for policy development processes and coordination mechanisms on labor migration in selected regional economic communities and AO member states. including development and review of rights-based and gender-responsive labor migration strategies. That being said, challenges remain. As we perceive, there are concerns about the EU free movement protocol with regard to security, foreign competition, also jobs that need to be addressed, as protectionist tendencies in some countries remain strong, and only a small number of EU member states has so far ratified the EU free movement protocol. Then, as was said by the two previous speakers, the collection and availability of reliable data on migration needs to be improved, in our view, especially on the migration of women, so that it can feed into gender-responsive policies for labor migration. And last but not least, the design and implementation of labor migration governance on the continental, regional, and national level, including alignment and harmonization between those levels, is a long-term process and requires long-standing commitment and support from donors.
Thank you for this remark and outlining some of the work that's being done at national, regional, but also continental level. And in light of this gap, but also the limitation that were outlined by the three other speakers, moving forward, what type of intervention could the European Union and EU member states support in the next few years? I think there is some concern about how can we make sure that this initiative address, all of these obstacles, seek to maximize the development benefit for these countries, but also, build on some of the work that's already been done and consult with them.
Yeah, in the context of what I just said and looking at it from a political level, in our view, continuous or even more support from the EU and its member states would be crucial to step up progress and address the mentioned challenges. The regional multi-annual indicative program for sub-Saharan Africa under the new NDICI financing instrument of the EU, as well as the two planned regional Team Europe initiatives on migration in Africa, provide new opportunities to support with regard to labor migration governance. All of these frameworks contain objectives or provisions to promote legal migration, not only towards Europe, but also within Africa. So the EU Commission, for example, can also build on previous experience in the area. For example, its cooperation with the African Union under the JLMP program and projects such as support free movement of persons and migration in West Africa, or towards free movement and transhumance in the IGAD regions. So some of these projects could serve as a useful basis for further engagement. And in our view, the two regional Team Europe initiatives, the TEIs on migration in Africa, should take African priorities, aims, and frameworks more into account to generate buy-in and ownership of African partner countries. Just to give an example from our side, so within the Team Europe initiative on migration in West Africa, German Development Cooperation is currently looking into the possibility to expand our existing advisory services that I mentioned before to intra-African migration, and possibly support cooperation of institutions, authorities across borders, for example, public employment services. So BMZ continues to advocate for its comprehensive approach with regard to migration and development at the EU level. As priorities in the area of migration may differ between African partners and the EU, we believe that a comprehensive approach is needed to take priorities from both sides into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting on this point on the importance of regional migration for development in this region, and also, the importance of consulting partners in Africa and having them owning also some of this initiative. I mean, on this, I'll turn to Leander and Lamphia before we open for Q&A. But Leander, maybe I have a question, and this applies to both of you. Based on what you know from the gaps in Ghana and Senegal, what are the areas where they could benefit from, the assistance of development actors to implement these new policies and move forward toward, better labor migration governance, be it at national level or regional level?
Right. So if I may come in, there are a number of areas that Ghana has attempted to address with regards to labor migration. So for instance, as a way of formalizing the processes, Ghana has adopted the approach of signing bilateral labor agreements with some countries. Unfortunately, for now, the countries are only limited to the Gulf states and then the Middle East. So my personal recommendation will be to have that replicated in the case of the EU. We know that Italy tried that out with Ghana in 2011 with a bilateral labor agreement, but that was short-lived. So for now, we only have Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia is in the works, and then a recent agreement between Ghana and then Barbados, where we supplied 97 nurses to Barbados. It's an experiment that is worth looking into. So I think that development partners in the EU could also extend these agreements to the EU and also even North America, just to formalize and have proper agreements in place. Another area is the short-term skills transfer approach. We know that GIZ is doing that, and then also IOM does assisted voluntary returns for some migrants who are prepared and willing to return. But I'll come back to the GIZ goal and approach. You know, the diasporas who are intended to return on the short-term basis are supported by GIZ to transfer their skills, and then the difference between the salary they would have earned in Europe and that in Ghana will be made up by the German government. I think this is a laudable kind of example that should be emulated by the other EU countries, because the focus here is migrants in Germany. But if we have other countries also having those type of programs in place, then the issue of skills transfer will be enhanced towards development. And integration is a major challenge upon return. Most migrants remigrate because of reintegration challenges. They have reverse cultural shock. So the process of assisting labor migrants, if they choose to return in a dignified way, in a sustainable manner, is one area that I think development partners might also be able to assist. Then finally, looking at the multi-stakeholder dialogues that GFA is carrying out on behalf of GIZ, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I might be biased because I'm the national consultant for the multi-stakeholder dialogues, but I think it's really critical, is yielding a lot of positive results where you are able to bring the different government ministries, departments, and agencies together to brainstorm on key priorities and approaches. It allows us to own the policies. So it's not an external imposition on the country, but then you have the stakeholders sitting around the table, agreeing in a dialogue kind of environment. And I think this is an area that should be supported. It shouldn't be left just to the German government to do the heavy lifting. The other governments are invited to join in, especially when it comes to on a bilateral or even the EU type of level. The main sticking point, as I mentioned earlier on, is the establishment of the Ghana National Commission on Migration. And this is critical. If this is established, at least we have a coordinating body which will go beyond just looking at labor migration, but all the different typologies of migration will be, activities in these areas will be coordinated by the Commission, and it will allow for proper policy planning, implementation, and also a win-win situation for countries in Europe, but also the countries of origin. And I think these are areas that are worth looking into. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Leander, for outlining this comprehensive plan. I think that gives definitely some ideas on what can come next. Lamphia, I don't know if you want to react to that from the perspective of Senegal, and maybe if you want to also say words on what you see as the role for ECOWAS in this area.
Yeah, I will be very short in this question. The main level on which we need support or assistance presently the first point is to reinforce the capacities of experts in charge of labor migration management. we remark scarce expertise in the field of labor migration nowadays. Nowadays, as you know it, migration is the privileged field of apprentice sorcerers, which with the big flow of financing in the migration sector, we have many actors without any required skill in migration who transform themselves as migration experts for reaping the opportunities. That's why in our developing countries, we need a real reinforcement of capacities on migration issues. The second point is to help us to enhance the financial, material, and human resources of main institutions in charge of labor migration issues and problems, because they have not the means necessary to implement or to realize the mission of the institutions. Third point is to help us to realize studies and research on the nature and the dynamic of labor market for improving its readability, because it is a fluid area. We have less knowledge on the reality of the labor market in our country. And the last point is to help us to set up a reliable and robust system of production, analysis, stockage, management, and diffusion of labor migration data or statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamphia. I want to follow up with 2 or 3 questions we had from the public. The first one is maybe directed to you again, Leander and Lamphia, on the resistance to free movement in the region. We know that exists from leaders, but also from citizens. And we had a question on, what levers do we have to decrease this resistance to free mobility in the region? And then maybe Dennis and Kate, I'll go back to you on the question of the GCM, the Global Compact for Migration, and to what extent activities of development agency should align, will support progress on this front moving forward.
Yeah. Okay, so let me start by commenting on the issue of resistance. It is a reality that most or some of the relatively wealthy West African countries are quite reluctant when it comes to the free movement of ECOWAS citizens into their countries. They don't have a problem when the movement is out of their countries to take up employment opportunities in other member states, but it becomes a problem. They become quite protective when it comes to allowing citizens to arrive in their countries. What doesn't help is the conflict between national policies and the ECOWAS free movement protocol requirements. So on the one hand, I give a typical example. On the one hand, in 1979, Ghana signed on the dotted line, agreeing to the protocol. But in 1994, and then again in 2013, Ghana came out with the GIPC Act, which excludes some sectors of the economy are totally excluded. Foreigners are excluded from some parts of the economy, like petty trading, and then some economic activities. And there's been no discrimination, like positive discrimination in favor of ECOWAS citizens. So it applies to all foreigners, all non-Ghanaians. So this is a classic example of a law that is at odds with the ECOWAS free movement protocol requirements. And it has led to a lot of tension between Ghanaian workers and ECOWAS citizens who are operating in Ghana. So Nigerians and then Ghanaians are constantly at loggerheads because on the one hand, some are using the ECOWAS free movement protocol as a basis for their activities, and then the Ghanaian traders are relying on the national laws. So I think this conflict between the national and then the ECOWAS level type of policies will need to be harmonized for the ECOWAS free movement protocol to take effect meaningfully. And it is a clear issue of the countries, the Sahelian countries or the landlocked countries tend to want to migrate to the coastal countries. And there's that pushback because those countries equally have unemployment challenges locally, and they are not too keen on admitting labor migrants from the region until such a time that we see this as a regional arrangement that is going to be a win-win situation for all member states. That hurdle will always be a stumbling block in terms of the full implementation of the ECOWAS Free Movement Protocol. And I think these are some of the issues that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leander. I don't know, Lamphia, if you want to react to this.
Yeah, I think Mr. Leander resumed quietly the situation. So it is a real problem in our CDAO community to respect the protocols of free movement, and at the frontiers there is many behavior of controllers which are independent of the volunteer of our leaders. So Senegal is a good student of the CEDEAO community, because in our country we have not problem with foreigners. We have any problems. The immigrants are free in our country, and we don't persecute them. We do many efforts to improve the living condition in Senegal. So I think many countries of the CEDEAO, the state member, must do effort, the same effort as Senegal, to promote the free movement of our communities member. It is not easy. So there is many activities to implement for sensibilize, inform the people to understand their human right, and the advantage of the CEDEAO, advantage legal framework which permit them to move freely in the regions or in the community space. I think we must do a real effort to sensibilize our leaders, public authorities, and all the population to master the real stake of the free movement in our country, because if you respect the commitments of all the state members, it will be a real way to boost our development process. And I think this is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this contribution on the potential and the benefits, promises of free movement in the region. I'll just turn to Dennis on this question about the Global Compact on migration, which I think connect more broadly to policy coherence. How do you align like all of these objectives between the intervention and development agencies and then national, regional, and continental effort? I don't know if you want to react to this, and Kate, happy for you to jump in after.
Yeah, the Global Compact on Migration is an important framework for us. It's obviously super comprehensive, but in terms of guidelines and principles, it is definitely very useful and serves as an orientation for us. In terms of development cooperation, we are also aware of our limitations, so that we can contribute, at least as a development ministry, only to a number of its objectives. But in the pact, it is also underlined that there should be a whole of government approach, a whole of society approach, and these are principles that we also hope to pursue, although it's sometimes difficult. In the end, it's also up to translating these rather or a bit abstract guiding principles and guidelines to country contexts. I mean, it depends also on the situation in partner countries to see how they can be materialized.
Kate, over to you.
Sure. So I would agree with Dennis. I think that it sets a common basis of understanding on all of these migration issues. So I think that one way in which the Global Compact is really useful is that it both sets out principles for managing migration well, and also sets out policy options for governments and other actors to sort of select from, right? So some of the activities it proposes are at a national level, some are at a regional level, some are even at a multilateral level. So it's a very comprehensive document, but I think that having that to refer back to and having that as a sort of common basis of understanding is a really useful contribution in this area. And then I think the other thing I would mention is some of the institutions and frameworks that have sprung up around implementation. We've seen the UN Migration Network being established, but there's also the regional review processes, which bring all of these actors together to discuss, how they're working together on implementing the Global Compact on migration within their particular regions. And so really addressing all of these governance issues. And in fact, the Africa Regional Review is happening this week and next. And so I think that's a nice example of how the Global Compact can both provide a sort of common understanding, but also basically add additional impetus for moving forward on some of these governance issues and providing sort of regional ownership to these processes as well.
Thank you very much, Kate and Dennis. And while I'm afraid we're going to have to close now, and I want to thank the audience for joining, and also thank you to our 4 panelists for sharing their thought and their analysis. I know there are a few questions we have not had time to address, and so we'll try to follow up by email. And so please don't hesitate to email us this question. We want to make sure they get answers. So the audio will be available a bit later on our website tomorrow. And we just want to remind you that we have this policy brief that we author and released now about a month ago, and we encourage you to follow the upcoming discussion on the EU side on programming on this question of labor migration in Africa. Thank you, everyone.